Panther won't leave hospital entrance. What she's waiting for will shock you. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. It started like any other ordinary day at the city hospital. Patients and visitors filed in and out of the automatic doors. Doctors bustled in white coats with hurried determination, and nurses moved with a sense of both calm and urgency. The sun was still rising, its golden light filtering through the glass walls of the lobby, and the faint hum of traffic could be heard from outside. It was then that the first person noticed her, something out of place, something startling. Black Panther. She was sitting just outside the hospital entrance, motionless as a statue, her dark, sleek fur blending into the shadows. At first, a few people thought their eyes were playing tricks on them. "No way," someone whispered to their companion, pointing hesitantly toward the creature. Others stopped mid-step, stunned and unsure whether to feel awe, fear, or confusion. After all, how often does one encounter such a majestic and powerful animal sitting calmly in an urban area, let alone right outside a busy hospital? The security guards were among the first to respond. "Everyone, back inside. Stay clear of the entrance," one shouted, his voice crackling over the radio as he called for backup. People moved quickly, murmuring nervously as they shuffled away from the entrance and peered through the glass from a safe distance. The Panther didn't move. She just sat there, her golden eyes fixed on something or someone inside the building. By now, the entire lobby was alive with speculation. Where did she come from? Is it dangerous? Someone call animal control. But amidst the chatter, one child pressed his small hand against the window and whispered enough she looked sad. He wasn't wrong. Though the Panther's posture was powerful, her muscles coiled beneath her shimmering coat, there was an unmistakable heaviness in her gaze. A sadness, perhaps even desperation, that no one could quite put into words. The arrival of animal control seemed inevitable. Within 20 minutes, a truck pulled up, and a man in khaki overalls stepped out holding a long pole with a looped rope at the end. He paused when he saw her, clearly taken aback by her calm demeanor. Most wild animals would have fled at the sound of approaching vehicles or human commotion, but this panther simply sat still, her gaze unwavering. "Strange," the man muttered under his breath. "She's not acting like any big cat I've ever seen." He approached cautiously, but with every step closer, the panther's ears flicked back slightly, and a low rumbling growl vibrated through the air. It wasn't aggressive, though. It was a warning, like a plea to be left alone. She didn't lunge or bare her teeth. She simply made it clear that she was not going to be moved. The man paused, clearly unsure what to do. "She's not here to attack anyone," he said finally, turning to the crowd. "If she was, she'd have done it already." A collective gasp rose from those watching, but the man's words brought a strange sense of calm. Even the hospital staff, though cautious, began to feel less afraid. There was something almost protective about the panther's presence, like she was standing guard, not threatening harm. Hours passed, and the panther didn't budge. People started to wonder if she was waiting for something or someone. In the hospital's pediatric ward, a young boy named Daniel was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, watching the scene unfold below. Daniel had been in and out of the hospital for months, battling an illness that had left him weak and frail. At just 9 years old, he had seen more doctors and nurses than he could count, and the sterile smell of hospitals had become as familiar to him as the scent of his favorite blanket. But today, as he looked out the window and saw the panther, something inside him stirred. It wasn't fear or worry, it was curiosity. "Mom," he whispered to his mother, who was sitting beside him. "Why is she here?" His mother smiled weakly, brushing his hair back. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe she's lost." But Daniel shook his head. "No, she's waiting for someone. I can feel it." His mother exchanged a glance with a nurse nearby, who offered a reassuring smile. "Animals are mysterious creatures," the nurse said softly. "Sometimes they know things we don't." By late afternoon, the crowd outside had grown. News stations had arrived, and cameras were rolling. The image of the Black Panther sitting steadfast outside the hospital had already gone viral, sparking debates and theories online. Was she someone's escaped pet? Had she wandered from a nearby wildlife preserve? Or was there something more mystical about her presence? Inside, Daniel had become increasingly restless. "I need to see her," he pleaded, tugging at his mother's sleeve. Daniel, no, his mother replied firmly. It's not safe. But she's here for a reason. I know it. The nurses tried to distract him with stories and games, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the panther was waiting for him. His chest ached as he thought of her sitting alone, surrounded by people who didn't understand. Please, he whispered when no one was watching, staring out the window. Don't leave. I'll come to you. As the sun began to set, the hospital's director made a final decision. We can't have a wild animal outside all night, he announced. It's a safety risk. He called for a wildlife specialist, hoping they could tranquilize the panther and relocate her to a safer place. But as if sensing what was coming, the panther rose to her feet for the first time all day. The crowd gasped as she stretched her powerful limbs and began to pace slowly, her golden eyes scanning the hospital's windows. Inside the pediatric ward, Daniel was still watching. His heart leapt as he saw her move, as if she were searching for something, searching for him. Mom, I have to go to her, Daniel said again, his voice trembling. Tears welled in his eyes. Please, I need to see her. His mother hesitated, torn between fear and her son's desperation. Finally, she nodded, her voice shaking. Okay, but only for a minute. A nurse helped Daniel into his wheelchair and wheeled him toward the lobby. By now, the crowd had parted, creating a path between the glass doors and the panther, who had stopped pacing and was staring intently at the entrance. When the doors slid open, the world seemed to hold its breath. The golden glow of the sunset painted everything in hues of amber and red, reflecting off the hospital's glass doors. The sound of the automatic doors swishing open broke the tense silence. Daniel, in his wheelchair, sat just inside the threshold, his face pale, but his eyes wide with wonder. His mother stood behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder, trembling slightly. The panther, who had been standing motionless outside, took a slow step forward. A hush fell over the crowd. People froze, their voices caught in their throats as they watched this magnificent creature move closer to the young boy. It was as though time itself slowed. Each step the panther took deliberate and purposeful. Stop, one of the security guards called, but he didn't dare approach. Everyone else watched stunned, unsure of whether they were about to witness something miraculous or terrifying. The hospital staff exchanged anxious glances, their hands hovering near phones and radios. But Daniel wasn't afraid. As the panther approached, her massive paws barely made a sound on the pavement. Her golden eyes locked onto Daniel's. For the boy, it felt as though those eyes could see into his very soul, into all the loneliness and pain he had carried during his long months in the hospital. She's not going to hurt me, Daniel whispered, his voice soft but firm. His mother gasped as the panther closed the distance, stopping just feet away from the boy. The great cat lowered her head, her gaze never breaking contact with his. Daniel reached out a hand, tentative but brave. It's okay, he said gently. You've been waiting, haven't you? The crowd collectively held its breath as Daniel's small hand moved closer. To everyone's disbelief, the panther leaned forward, pressing her head gently into his outstretched palm. The soft purr that rumbled from her chest was deep and soothing, completely at odds with her fierce, powerful appearance. The scene felt otherworldly. No one dared to move or speak. Even the usual hum of city traffic seemed to fade into silence as this moment unfolded before them. A boy in a wheelchair and a wild panther, two creatures from completely different worlds, connected in a way that defied logic. I knew you were waiting for me, Daniel murmured. His mother's eyes were filled with tears, and she clutched her chest as if to steady her heartbeat. Behind them, the hospital staff stared in shock. Nurses, doctors, and patients lined the lobby windows, watching with tears in their eyes. Some whispered prayers, while others fumbled with their phones to capture what they could only describe as a miracle. She's protecting him, someone said. Or maybe she came to see him, another added softly. The wildlife specialist who had been called earlier stepped forward cautiously, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. He knelt down a few feet from the panther and Daniel. Son, he said softly, trying not to startle either of them. You're very brave. Do you know this panther? Daniel shook his head slowly. Not really, he said, but I feel like I do. The wildlife expert studied the panther's body language. This isn't normal behavior for a wild animal, he muttered under his breath, glancing toward the hospital staff. She's calm, focused, like she knows exactly what she's doing. It wasn't just the panther's demeanor that baffled him. It was the way she seemed to recognize Daniel, as if their connection was deeper than anyone could understand. "What do you mean?" Daniel's mother asked, her voice cracking as she struggled to process what's happening. The expert hesitated before replying. "Sometimes animals have instincts we don't fully understand. They're drawn to certain people they sense need them." Daniel looked up at the man, his hands still resting on the panther's head. "She's been waiting for me," he said again, this time with more certainty. "I know it." The panther seemed to respond to his words, rumbling another deep, comforting purr. Her massive frame lowered to the ground as she lay beside Daniel's wheelchair, her golden eyes softening as though she were watching over him. The sight sent chills through everyone present. A wild predator, feared and admired for her strength, now lay protectively beside a fragile young boy who had spent months confined to a hospital bed. As the evening grew darker, the hospital director made his way to the scene, trying to make sense of it all. "We can't leave her out here all night," he said quietly to the wildlife specialist. "What do we do?" The man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's not going anywhere without him," he admitted. "Look at her. She's not here by accident." "But why?" Daniel's mother asked softly, her tear-streaked face lit by the faint glow of the hospital lights. "What does she want?" The wildlife expert didn't have an answer. Instead, he turned his attention back to Daniel. "Son," he said gently, "do you feel okay with her here?" Daniel nodded without hesitation. "She makes me feel safe," he said, "like everything's going to be okay." His words sent a ripple of emotion through the crowd. Even the hospital staff, who had been so wary at first, felt their hearts soften. "Let's let them be for now," the wildlife expert said finally. "She's not a threat. She's here for a reason." Throughout the night, the panther remained at her post beside Daniel. His mother had wheeled him back into the hospital lobby, where he could rest near the glass doors. The panther, too, stayed outside, her golden eyes ever watchful. It was as if she were standing guard, not just over Daniel, but over the entire hospital. By morning, word of the panther had spread far and wide. News crews arrived, and social media buzzed with photos and videos of the extraordinary scene. People around the world were captivated by the story of a wild panther who had come to sit outside a hospital, refusing to leave the side of a sick young boy. Inside the hospital, something else remarkable was happening. Daniel, who had been growing weaker in recent weeks, seemed to come alive in the panther's presence. His color was better, his energy had returned, and for the first time in months he laughed. "She's helping him," one nurse whispered to another. "It's like she's his guardian angel." The hospital director arranged for the area to remain clear and safe, allowing Daniel's visits to the panther to continue under careful supervision. Each time the boy was wheeled to the entrance, the panther would rise, her tail swishing gently as she pressed her head against his hand. It was as though she knew that her work, whatever mysterious purpose had brought her here, wasn't yet complete. For Daniel, the panther was more than just an animal. She was a friend, a protector, and a symbol of hope. And as his strength began to return, doctors couldn't explain it. His mother, however, believed she knew. "She's healing him," she said softly one afternoon as she watched the two together. "Somehow, she's helping him heal." By the end of the week, Daniel's health had improved so much that the doctors made an announcement that brought tears to his family's eyes. Daniel was strong enough to go home. The day of his discharge was bittersweet. Daniel sat in his wheelchair at the hospital entrance, staring into the golden eyes of the panther who had been his silent companion for so many days. "Are you leaving now?" he asked softly, his voice full of emotion. The panther seemed to understand. She rose to her feet and walked closer to him, pressing her forehead against his hand one last time. Daniel closed his eyes, savoring the moment. "Thank you," he whispered. His mother wiped tears from her cheeks as she wheeled him toward their car. The panther watched them go, her golden eyes following Daniel until he was out of sight. Then, without a sound, she turned and disappeared into the nearby woods, her purpose fulfilled. The days that followed were filled with a strange emptiness. For Daniel and his family, the panther's sudden departure felt like losing a dear friend. The hospital buzzed with quiet chatter, staff and patients alike recounting what they had seen. It was impossible to deny that something magical had happened, a connection between a fragile boy and a wild animal that defied all understanding. At home, Daniel's strength continued to improve. His mother marveled at how he seemed brighter, happier, like a spark had been reignited within him. The doctors called his recovery miraculous, but Daniel knew the truth. "She helped me," he told his mother one day as they sat on the porch. "The Panther. She knew I needed her." His mother, sitting close by with her arm around his shoulders, didn't argue. She had seen the way Daniel had changed since meeting the Panther. It wasn't just his physical health. There was a new light in his eyes. "She came for you," she agreed softly. "I don't know how or why, but I believe that too." As the sun set, Daniel closed his eyes and let his mind wander. Somewhere out there, he was certain the Panther was watching over him, maybe even waiting for him again. In the days that followed, Daniel's story became national news. Reporters showed up at their house, cameras flashing as they asked questions Daniel couldn't answer. "Why did the Panther come for you?" one asked. "Did you know her before?" another chimed in. "No," Daniel replied quietly, feeling overwhelmed. "I didn't know her. She just found me." His mother stepped in to protect him, ushering the reporters away and closing the door firmly behind them. "He's had enough," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Daniel, for his part, didn't want to be famous. He didn't understand why people were so interested. The Panther had come for him, and that was all that mattered. But somewhere, deep inside, he began to wonder. Why had she come for him? Was there more to the story? One night, as Daniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a noise outside caught his attention. It was faint, just the soft rustle of leaves. At first, he thought it might be the wind, but something told him otherwise. He pushed back his blanket and climbed out of bed, his heart pounding. Moving as quietly as he could, he opened the window and peered out into the darkness. And there, in the shadows of the trees, he saw her, the Panther. Her golden eyes glowed in the moonlight, fixed on him just as they had been at the hospital. For a moment, Daniel froze, unsure whether he was dreaming. But then she stepped forward, her powerful frame moving silently through the grass. "Mom," he whispered loudly, turning back toward the door. "Mom, come quick." His mother appeared moments later, her hair tousled and her face groggy. "Daniel, what is it?" He pointed out the window. "It's her. She's here." His mother's eyes widened as she followed his gaze. At first, she didn't see anything. But then, just as Daniel had described, the Panther emerged from the shadows, standing still and regal in the moonlit yard. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Daniel, what is she doing here?" "I don't know," Daniel whispered. "But she's here for me. I know it." They watched in silence for several minutes, afraid to move. The Panther stayed where she was, her golden eyes never leaving Daniel. She wasn't threatening. There was a calmness about her that mirrored the way she had behaved at the hospital. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I need to go to her." His mother's heart nearly stopped. "No, Daniel. You can't. She's wild. It's too dangerous." But Daniel shook his head. "She won't hurt me. You saw it yourself. She came to me before, and now she's back." His mother hesitated, torn between her instincts to protect him and the inexplicable trust she felt toward the Panther. Finally, she sighed. "Okay, but I'm coming with you." Together, they stepped out onto the porch. The Panther didn't move, but her eyes followed their every step. Daniel's mother held his hand tightly, her pulse racing as they walked across the lawn. When they were just a few feet away, the Panther lowered her head and let out a low, gentle rumble. It was the same sound she had made at the hospital, a deep, soothing purr. "Hi again," Daniel whispered, his voice full of wonder. He knelt down, his mother hovering nervously behind him. "You came back for me, didn't you?" The Panther stepped closer, closing the distance between them. To Daniel's amazement, she nudged her head gently against his shoulder, just as she had done before. His mother let out a small gasp, tears streaming down her face. "She knows you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "She really knows you." Daniel looked up at her, his own eyes shining with emotion. "She's my friend," he said simply. The Panther stayed with him through the night, lying silently on the lawn as though standing guard. Daniel and his mother sat on the porch, watching her in awe. It was a night neither of them would ever forget. By morning, word had spread again. Neighbors gathered at the edge of their property, whispering in disbelief. "It's the Panther from the news," one woman said. "The one who was at the hospital." "What's she doing here?" someone else asked. "I don't know," another replied. "But she's with that boy again." As the day wore on, the wildlife experts who had been called before arrived once more. They approached the panther cautiously, trying to determine her intentions. But just like at the hospital, she showed no aggression. She remained calm and watchful, always staying close to Daniel. "She's here for a reason," the lead expert said, shaking his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like this." Daniel stayed by her side the entire time, running his small hand through her sleek fur. "I think she came to check on me," he said quietly, "to make sure I'm okay." His mother wiped her eyes as she watched them together. "And are you?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." As evening approached, the panther stood and stretched, her golden eyes turning once more toward the woods. Daniel understood. "You're leaving again, aren't you?" he said softly, his voice filled with both sadness and gratitude. The panther nudged him gently, as if to say goodbye. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "For everything." With one final glance, the panther turned and disappeared into the trees, her powerful form blending seamlessly with the shadows. Daniel and his mother stood silently, watching until she was gone. "She'll be back," Daniel said after a long pause. His mother knelt beside him, brushing a lock of hair from his face. "Maybe," she replied softly. "But even if she doesn't come back, you'll always have her with you." Daniel nodded, his heart full. The panther had given him more than he could ever explain: hope, strength, and the belief that he was never truly alone. Over the weeks that followed, Daniel's story became legend. People around the world were captivated by the tale of a wild panther who had come to the aid of a sick young boy, forging an unexplainable bond that defied the boundaries of nature. For Daniel, life slowly returned to normal. But every now and then, he would glance out at the edge of the woods, hoping to see those golden eyes watching over him once more. And though the panther never returned in the way he had hoped, Daniel always felt her presence. She had been his guardian when he needed it most, and in his heart, she would remain with him forever. Months passed, and Daniel's remarkable recovery remained a topic of conversation within the hospital and the local community. What began as hushed whispers had turned into a full-blown phenomenon. People spoke of the panther with reverence and wonder, calling her Daniel's guardian or protector. Some even speculated that she was no ordinary animal, but a spiritual guide, sent to watch over the boy in his time of need. Daniel, however, thought of her simply as his friend, a silent, mysterious companion who had shown him an unspoken kindness when the world seemed at its darkest. Whenever his mother or doctors asked how he was feeling, he always responded with a small smile. "I'm stronger because of her," he would say. While Daniel's health steadily improved, his mind often wandered back to those golden eyes and the way the panther had stood by him as though she understood his pain. Each night as he lay in bed, he would stare at his window and imagine her out there, hidden in the trees, watching over him. Sometimes he dreamed of her, of running through dense forests at her side, the wind whipping past his face as the two of them raced together like old friends. But in his waking hours, Daniel's life carried on. He went back to school, regaining his energy day by day. His classmates were curious about the panther, peppering him with questions he couldn't quite answer. "Why did she come for you?" one boy asked during recess. "Are you sure she wasn't dangerous?" a girl added skeptically. Daniel shrugged, unwilling to explain something he still didn't fully understand. "She wasn't dangerous. She just cared." His words hung in the air, leaving the other children speechless. They may not have understood, but for Daniel, the truth was simple. The panther had come for him when no one else could. That bond, he knew, was something rare and precious, something no one else could take away. One chilly afternoon, Daniel and his mother decided to visit the hospital for a follow-up appointment. The doctors had been eager to track his progress, given how extraordinary his recovery had been. As they walked through the familiar halls, nurses and staff greeted Daniel warmly, marveling at how much healthier he looked. "You're like a new kid," one nurse said with a grin. "The last time you were here, you could barely sit up in bed." Daniel smiled shyly, grateful for the warmth but still feeling out of place. The hospital, with its sterile smell and quiet corridors, brought back a flood of memories, some good, some difficult. He couldn't help but glance toward the large glass doors at the entrance. Would she ever come back? As if reading his thoughts, Daniel's mother placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're thinking about her again, aren't you?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I guess I just miss her." His mother sighed softly, brushing a lock of hair from his face. She did something for you that no one else could. I'll never forget that. But maybe she came to show us that you're stronger than we ever knew. Daniel looked up at her, his brow furrowing. But what if she's out there waiting for me again? What if I need to find her? His mother didn't respond right away. She knelt beside him, her expression gentle but firm. Daniel, the panther gave you a gift. She stayed with you when you were weak, and now you're stronger. But you don't have to find her to keep her with you. She's already in here. She tapped a finger against his chest, over his heart. Daniel let her words sink in, but a part of him still longed to see those golden eyes again. I just hope she's okay, he whispered finally. I think she's exactly where she's meant to be, his mother replied. As the months turned to seasons, Daniel's story spread far beyond their small town. News stations and wildlife organizations continued to discuss the mysterious panther. Some called her an anomaly, others a miracle. Biologists tried to track her movements, analyzing footage from security cameras at the hospital and nearby neighborhoods. We've never seen behavior like this in a wild panther, one expert explained on a televised interview. They are solitary and elusive animals, rarely interacting with humans unless provoked. For this panther to have approached a child, let alone stayed near him for days, defies everything we know about their species. Another expert chimed in with speculation. It's possible the panther sensed something in Daniel, something that drew her to him. Animals have instincts we don't fully understand. Maybe she recognized his vulnerability. The interview ended with a clip of Daniel's story, him in his hospital bed, the panther by his side. The world watched in awe as the footage replayed over and over again. To Daniel, the attention didn't matter. What mattered was the bond they had shared, one that couldn't be explained or dissected by scientists. On Daniel's birthday that year, his family decided to celebrate outdoors with a small picnic near the edge of the woods. It was a warm, golden afternoon, the kind where everything felt peaceful and still. Daniel's friends played tag while his parents set up food and blankets beneath the tall oak trees. Don't wander too far, Daniel, his mother called as he ran off with his friends. I won't, he shouted back. But as the other children chased each other through the open field, Daniel slowed down. Something in the distance had caught his eye, a shadow at the edge of the forest, just beyond the sunlight's reach. He froze, his heart pounding. Could it be? Slowly, he walked toward the trees, ignoring the sounds of laughter behind him. The shadow didn't move, but he could feel it watching him. When he reached the tree lean, Daniel stopped and held his breath. And then, out of the shadows, she appeared. The panther. Her golden eyes locked onto his, just as they had that first day at the hospital. She stepped forward silently, her sleek, powerful body gliding through the underbrush. Daniel felt his chest tighten with emotion, tears springing to his eyes. You're here, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I knew you'd come back. The panther stopped just a few feet away, her gaze soft but unwavering. She didn't make a sound, but Daniel could feel her calmness, her reassurance. I'm okay now, Daniel told her. Because of you. The panther tilted her head slightly, as if understanding every word. For a moment, the two of them stood there, connected by something that went beyond words. Then slowly, the panther turned and disappeared back into the forest, leaving nothing but the rustle of leaves in her wake. Daniel watched her go, a small smile spreading across his face. He knew this wasn't goodbye. Not really. The panther had shown him something extraordinary, that kindness and connection could come from the most unexpected places. As he turned back toward his family, Daniel felt lighter than he had in months. The panther might be gone, but her presence would always be with him. And for the first time, he truly believed that he was going to be okay. But for Daniel, it was not imagination. The panther was real. She was real. He could still feel the calming presence of her golden eyes. Somehow, he knew deep down that the panther was watching over him. And now, as he sat alone in the hospital lobby, staring at the front entrance, that same quiet, unshakable feeling returned. The hospital was unusually quiet that morning. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting golden pools of light onto the shiny tile floor. Daniel adjusted himself in his wheelchair, looking out through the glass doors with a distant expression, searching. He didn't know what for, but something inside him told him to wait. Then it happened. At first, it was subtle. A shadow, a massive, elegant shadow, passed over the sunlit entrance. It was brief and easy to dismiss. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He squinted, leaning forward in his chair as much as his small body would allow. The shadow returned, this time lingering. And then the glass doors opened with a faint hiss. The hospital staff didn't notice at first. A nurse hurried by with a clipboard, too preoccupied with her morning rounds. An orderly pushed an empty gurney down the hall. And outside, silhouetted against the morning sun, the Panther stood. She was back. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He couldn't believe his eyes. The Panther moved slowly, with the same deliberate grace he remembered from the forest. Her coat glistened in the sunlight, impossibly sleek and dark, and her golden eyes, those impossibly calm, wise eyes, locked onto him as if she had traveled through time and space just for this moment. "She found me," Daniel whispered. A murmur began spreading through the lobby. A security guard finally noticed her, his face paling as he reached for the radio strapped to his hip. Patients in waiting chairs exchanged anxious glances. Someone gasped. Another voice yelled, "It's a Panther!" The staff scrambled. Alarms began to blare, and people backed away from the entrance. But the Panther didn't budge. She sat down just outside the hospital doors, her gaze never leaving Daniel. The chaos around her seemed meaningless. It was as though the Panther was immune to the panic, anchored in something far deeper. Daniel wheeled himself closer to the entrance. His hands trembled as they gripped the wheels of his chair. "Stop him," a nurse called out. "Get him away from the doors." But Daniel didn't stop. He rolled forward with determination, his small face resolute. The noise around him melted away. The alarms, the shouting, the hurried footsteps. All he could see was her. When he reached the glass, he stopped. The Panther stood up, approaching the door slowly. For a long, perfect moment, there was nothing but silence as the two of them stared at each other. Daniel lifted a hand, pressing his palm against the glass. He half expected the Panther to growl, to act like the predator she was. But instead, she leaned forward, her nose brushing the other side of the glass in a gesture so tender it took Daniel's breath away. "She's not here to hurt anyone," Daniel said softly. A doctor approached cautiously, keeping his voice low as he spoke into a radio. "Animal control is on the way. Keep everyone back." "No," Daniel cried out. "Don't call them. She's my friend." The doctor stared at the boy in disbelief. "Daniel, that's a wild animal. You have to stay back. It's dangerous." "She's not dangerous," Daniel insisted. "She's here for me." The words hung in there. Another staff member tugged at the doctor's sleeve. "Wait, look at her." The Panther stood perfectly still, watching Daniel as if no one else in the room existed. It was a connection beyond logic, a bond that no one could explain. People began to whisper, exchanging uncertain glances. The staff started to back away from the doors, no longer sure what to make of the situation. "Why is she here?" someone asked. Daniel knew the answer. He didn't have to say it. He just knew. The Panther had come because Daniel needed her, just like he needed her back in the forest. "Let me go to her," Daniel said. The doctor shook his head. "Daniel, that's not possible." The Panther turned her head toward the doctor for a split second, her golden eyes flashing. It wasn't a threat. It was almost as if she understood the man's hesitation. Then she turned back to Daniel, and in her eyes he saw something remarkable: trust. Daniel's mother appeared, rushing into the lobby with tears streaming down her face. "What's happening?" "Daniel." "Mom," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "She's my friend. She saved me before. She's here to save me now." His mother looked from her son to the Panther and back again. There was fear in her eyes, but also something else, an understanding, faint and fragile. The Panther sat down again, waiting. The boy and the great cat stared at each other as if the rest of the world had disappeared. "Let me go," Daniel whispered. His mother hesitated, torn between every instinct telling her to protect her child and an impossible connection unfolding before her. And then something extraordinary happened. The glass doors slid open. No one knew who triggered it, whether it was a mistake or fate itself, but the doors opened and the Panther stepped forward. She moved carefully, her paws barely making a sound as they touched the hospital floor. Everyone held their breath, frozen in place. The Panther stopped just a few feet from Daniel. The boy reached out a shaking hand, and the great cat lowered her head, allowing him to touch her. Her fur was warm, softer than he'd imagined. "You came back," Daniel whispered. The panther closed her eyes for a moment, as if acknowledging his words. Tears streamed down Daniel's face. He didn't know how she'd found him or why, but he didn't need to understand. All that mattered was that she was here. "She's not here to hurt anyone," Daniel repeated softly. "She's here to help." The hospital staff stood in stunned silence, unable to explain what they were witnessing. Security had stopped moving. Even Daniel's mother was too overwhelmed to speak. The panther turned her gaze to Daniel's mother, her golden eyes locking onto the woman's. For a moment, it felt as though the panther was asking for permission to help the boy she'd come for. And Daniel's mother nodded. Daniel felt a rush of warmth, a kind of energy that spread through his entire body as the panther remained by his side. The hospital lobby, once filled with alarm and fear, had fallen completely silent. No one dared move. The staff and onlookers could hardly believe what they were witnessing. This enormous predator, an animal feared and admired in equal measure, was standing beside a frail boy in a wheelchair as if she were his protector. Slowly, Daniel reached out again, letting his small hand rest gently on the panther's head. She closed her eyes for a moment, pressing into his touch, as though she'd been waiting for this, waiting for him. "I told you," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "She's my friend." The nurses, who had been holding back, exchanged uneasy glances. "This can't be real," one of them murmured. "It is real," Daniel insisted, looking up at the adults around him. "She's here to help. She's always been here to help me." The truth of those words echoed through the room. People were beginning to sense that this wasn't some random encounter. This was something more, a miracle, perhaps. Daniel's mother, tears streaming down her cheeks, knelt beside her son and gently touched his shoulder. "Daniel, how is this possible?" she asked softly. Daniel smiled faintly. "I don't know, Mom, but I think she knows I need her." The panther turned her head, eyes fixed on Daniel's mother, as though she understood every word. For a fleeting moment, the woman felt her heart ache, not with fear, but with awe. There was no malice in the panther's gaze, no danger. Only calm, only love. "It's like she's guarding him," someone whispered from the back of the crowd. And it was true. The great cat remained perfectly still, poised but relaxed, as if her only purpose in life at that moment was to protect the boy beside her. Daniel turned to the panther, stroking her fur with trembling hands. "Do you remember the forest?" he whispered to her. "When you found me, you knew I was scared. You didn't leave me then, and you didn't leave me now." The panther's golden eyes shimmered as she stared into Daniel's face. He felt as though she could see straight into his heart, into the pain and struggles he'd carried for so long. "She's connected to him," said one of the doctors in a hushed voice. "I don't understand it, but it's like they know each other." The security guards, who had initially reached for their weapons, now stood down. Even they couldn't bring themselves to act against the panther. There was something about her, something so unshakable, so profound, that told them she meant no harm. At that moment, the hospital director arrived, demanding answers. "What is going on here?" he barked as he entered the lobby. "Why is there an animal in my hospital?" The nurse nearest to him stammered. "Sir, it's not attacking anyone. It came for Daniel." The director's eyes narrowed as he looked at the scene before him. "You're telling me this panther is here for that child?" He didn't believe it. How could he? But when his eyes fell on Daniel, and the way the boy's hand rested gently on the panther's head, something shifted in his expression. "Let them be," Daniel's mother said softly, wiping tears from her face. "Just let them be." For once, the director didn't argue. He turned to the crowd of staff and patients. Everyone stepped back. "Give them space." Slowly, the people in the lobby retreated, their curiosity and fear giving way to quiet reverence. No one wanted to disturb what was unfolding before them, a moment so rare, so impossible, that it seemed like something out of a storybook. The panther turned her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over the room as if making sure that no harm would come to Daniel. Then she pressed her massive head against the boy's chest, as though hugging him. Daniel smiled, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not alone anymore," he whispered. Daniel's mother dropped to her knees beside him, sobbing softly. "You were never alone," she said. "But she's here for you in a way I can't explain." The panther's breathing was slow and steady, her presence soothing. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The hospital, the machines, the endless checkups, the needles faded away. All he could feel was the warmth of the panther beside him, her unwavering loyalty filling the empty spaces in his heart. For what felt like forever, no one moved. The morning sunlight filtered through the glass doors, casting a golden glow over the boy and the panther, as though the world itself had paused to bear witness to their connection. Finally, the panther stood up. She turned toward the doors, her golden eyes lingering on Daniel one last time. It was as if she were saying goodbye, not forever, but just for now. "Don't go," Daniel whispered. "Please don't go." The panther lowered her head, gently nuzzling his hand one final time. Then she turned and walked through the sliding doors, back into the world outside. Daniel watched her go, his heart aching, but he didn't feel empty this time. He felt stronger, braver. "She'll come back," he said softly, his voice full of quiet conviction. "I know she will." Daniel's mother hugged him tightly. "She gave you something I couldn't, didn't she?" Daniel nodded. "She gave me hope." Outside, the panther paused at the edge of the hospital grounds, turning her head to look back at the building one last time. For anyone watching, it would have seemed impossible, but to Daniel, it was clear as day. She was saying, "I will always be here." Then, with one final graceful step, the panther disappeared into the trees. And though she was gone, Daniel knew she wasn't really gone at all. The bond they shared would remain with him forever, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, something extraordinary can happen, something that changes everything. In the days that followed, the story of the panther spread far beyond the hospital walls. People from all over the town, and even far beyond, were talking about it. Some called it a miracle, while others speculated about the impossible connection between the boy and the wild animal. News outlets picked up the story, adding their own embellishments, and soon the hospital was flooded with calls and visitors wanting to understand what had happened. But for Daniel, the truth didn't need explanations. He didn't need the reporters asking questions or the scientists trying to understand why a wild panther would walk into a hospital just to sit with him. All that mattered was how it made him feel. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel invisible. The next morning, as Daniel sat by his hospital window, sunlight streaming in, his thoughts drifted to the panther. Outside, the day was bright and calm, but there was a quiet yearning inside him, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she would come back. His mother sat beside him, reading a book out loud to keep him company. Her voice was soft and steady, but Daniel's mind was far away, thinking of the forest, of her golden eyes, of the feeling of her warmth. "Mom," Daniel whispered suddenly, interrupting her. "Do you think she's okay? Out there?" His mother looked up from the book, pausing to search for the right words. "Yes," she said softly. "I think she's where she's supposed to be right now." Daniel frowned. "But what if she needs me like I need her?" His mother smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Sometimes the ones we love find ways to take care of themselves, just like she took care of you." Daniel nodded slowly, though the ache in his chest didn't go away. He turned back to the window, his gaze fixed on the trees in the distance. Meanwhile, outside the hospital grounds, whispers of movement stirred in a nearby forest. The great black panther moved silently through the shadows, her powerful form blending seamlessly with the landscape. Though she was hidden from view, her sharp eyes were still watching. She had not gone far. The forest felt alive around her. Birds fluttered through the canopy, leaves rustled softly in the wind, but the panther's focus remained steady. She was waiting for something only she could understand. In the hospital, Daniel began to recover faster than anyone expected. His doctors were amazed at the progress he made in the weeks that followed. The frail boy who had once struggled to get out of bed now had a newfound strength, as if the encounter with a panther had sparked something inside him that no medicine or treatment ever could. "You're like a completely different boy," one of the nurses told him with a smile as she adjusted his fur. "What's your secret?" Daniel grinned. "I had a friend who helped me." The nurse chuckled, thinking he meant one of the hospital staff or perhaps a therapy animal. "Well, whatever it is, keep it up. You're doing so well." One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Daniel's mother wheeled him outside for some fresh air. He hadn't been beyond the hospital doors since that day, and the crisp air felt refreshing against his skin. They sat on a bench near the edge of the hospital grounds, watching the horizon glow in shades of orange and gold. Daniel's mother sighed contentedly, running her fingers through her son's hair. "Isn't it beautiful?" she whispered. Daniel didn't respond. He was staring intently at the tree line in the distance. His heart started to race, his breath catching in his throat. "Mom," he whispered. "Look." His mother followed his gaze, her eyes widening as she saw it too, a flicker of movement just beyond the trees. The silhouette of a large, graceful creature stepped forward, and even in the fading light, there was no mistaking her. The panther. She emerged slowly, her golden eyes glowing as she fixed her gaze on Daniel. She was still majestic, still powerful, and yet there was a softness about her. "Come." Daniel's mother clutched his shoulder. "It's her," she breathed. "How can this be?" Daniel's smile grew wide, and his eyes brimmed with tears. She came back. The panther took a step closer, but she didn't approach fully. She simply stood there watching him, as though checking to make sure he was okay. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and knowing. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, his voice carrying across the distance. The panther seemed to understand. She blinked slowly, then turned her head, looking back toward the forest as though beckoning him to see what she saw. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the connection between them surge through him like a warm light. When he opened them, the panther was gone, slipping silently back into the trees as though she had never been there at all. But this time, Daniel didn't feel sad. He didn't feel alone. He felt whole. "Did you see her?" Daniel asked softly, turning to his mother. She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "I saw her. She'll always be out there," Daniel said with certainty, "watching over me." His mother hugged him tightly, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "And you'll always have her here," she said, placing a hand over his heart. The story of the panther and the boy became a local legend. People who heard about it would shake their heads in disbelief, but for those who had been at the hospital that day, they knew the truth. Some miracles can't be explained. Some connections go beyond words. As Daniel grew stronger and began to heal, he carried the panther's memory with him everywhere. It gave him courage, strength, and hope. Whenever he felt scared or unsure, he would close his eyes and picture her golden eyes staring back at him, reminding him that he was never truly alone. Years later, when Daniel was older and the hospital visits were far behind him, he would often find himself walking to the edge of the forest, standing there quietly, just looking out into the trees. He didn't need to see her to know she was there. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the panther watched, waiting, guarding, loving. Because some bonds, no matter how improbable, can never be broken.